Haverfordwest has always had its fair share of characters, and among its older residents are many with a tale to tell. Derek, Rees and I have lately had the pleasure of talking to four of these gentlemen and of recording their memories for this video. The four gentlemen we interviewed told us a great deal, not only about their early days in the town, but of their working lives. James Eaton Evans was the magistrate's clerk in the Shire Hall. Joffre Swales worked for many years in the county offices and, to my great surprise, was briefly the master of Haverfordwest Workhouse. Jack Holt worked for many years for the post office, and Bill Richards was a journalist for the West Wales Guardian. They recounted all manner of memories in the town in the years between the two great wars, and we are delighted to be able to preserve these memories here. James Eaton Evans practised in town as a solicitor for many years, working also as magistrate's clerk, first for the Haverfordwest district and later for most of Pembrokeshire. Of particular interest is the fact that he is a descendant of two historic Haverfordwest families, the Stokeses and the Fortunes. His great-uncle's brother, Admiral Lord Stokes, had a distinguished naval career, while Sir Charles Fortune, from whom he is descended on his mother's side, was a noted town benefactor and the man who left Fortune's frolic to the town. But I'm going to start first, if I could, by asking you, whereabouts in town were you brought up, and what are your earliest memories of the town?
When my father got married, he rented a little property in Goat Street. It was for a long time occupied by Marriage, do you remember, who was one of the chief men in Green's Motors. Oh, yeah. And we lived there for a couple of years. I was born in Goat Street, only for a couple of years, and then father rented Montrose in Merlin's Hill, and we were there a couple of years. I can't remember much about it. And then in 1917 we moved down to Everlenno. My grandfather and grandmother lived there until the early part of the First War, but they found it too difficult and there was a shortage of staff, and they moved into Haverfordwest, and the house was empty for a couple of years. But father came there and we lived there in 1917.
Nice. Well, were there many servants in Everlenno?
Oh Lord, mother had to manage it almost by herself. I think at one time she had somebody to help to do some cleaning, but she never had a cook or anybody there. I mean, the staff was sure. We only had a gardener. That's all there was.
So thinking of Everlenno, I know the correct thing now is to call it by the Welsh name of Aberllanw and so on. But what did you call it?
We used to call it Everlenno. That's all. You see, father and grandfather, we were never. Family were never Welsh speakers, no. and I never spoke Welsh because my mother was English and I went away to school in England.
Ah. Yes. Were you in any of the local primary schools before that?
I went for a couple of years to a Miss Ellis who had a little school at the bottom of Goat Street. I can remember there, but my only memory of that is we used to write on a slate. And I can remember we used to do sums on the slate, and I had to be quick to copy off my next door neighbour before he turned over the slate.
Who was the next door neighbour?
I don't know who the person was. I think there was the farmer's son. There were. But I was only there for a couple of years, and then when I was 7, I went to a school in Tenby. Ah, yes. It was called St Andrews, at the top of the North Cliff. And I was there for 3 or 4 years.
And then off to...
Then I went down to a school in Worthing. I was down there for a couple of years, and then I went to Morton College for 4 years.
Ah, yeah. So what was your first job then?
Oh, I was articled to my father in the solicitor's office in 12 High Street. It was then Eaton Evans and Williams.
That's right.
And I was articled to my father, and I served 5 years articles. And then there wasn't any place for me in the firm then, and I felt that we were being taken over by the Williamses, and the office belonged to my father, and I arranged for him really to dissolve the old partnership, because they were in the process of telling him to retire because he wasn't very well. Then I set up almost on my own with my father, but he wasn't doing very much. Yeah.
And how long did that business
Well,
continue?
to begin with, I had as a partner Humphrey Ward. He was a brother of Jim Ward, who was the docks manager in Milford. But that didn't go very well because he left about early 1939, and Marley Sampson arranged for J.P. Morris, who was working in Carmarthen, to come to me. And he came and joined me in May 1939, because I wanted some older person there, because at that time I was in the Territorial Army, and I expected to be called up in the war, which I was. And Jack Morris carried on all through the war. And I had something to come back to when I came out of the army in November 1945.
And the business then was thriving when you came.
It was called, we used to call ourselves Eaton Evans and Morris then. We still are calling that today. And I was there, well, in 12 High Street all my life.
Yes.
All my working life.
And when were you asked to become clerk to the magistrates?
In June 1948, Edgar Williams was clerk of the magistrates of the old Haverfordwest Borough Court and Dewsland, which was the area around St David's. And he retired in June 1948, and he got me appointed. It wasn't a very profitable appointment. Haverfordwest Borough, we had a salary of £300 a year, and Dewsland 150. And out of that I had to provide office accommodation, any clerk I wanted, all the stationery, the telephones, postages, everything, even travelling. But that went on until 1955. And then by which time there was quite a well, the adjustment of courts. They got rid of some of the small courts. When I first, remember, up until about 1955, Haverfordwest had its own Commission of the Peace, separate from Pembrokeshire, and they were local town magistrates. They only sat in the borough court in Haverfordwest. And when I first started, the mayor each year was the chairman, and you can imagine he had very little knowledge of the law, and a lot depended on the clerk.
So the chairman would change round every year? Change
round every year. Now, the Haverfordwest Borough Court finished in 1955, when Haverfordwest Borough Court was amalgamated with Roos Court and with Dungleddy, which sat at Clarbeston Road. They had a little court in the tin shed at the back of the pub, the Picton Arms, and it became the Haverfordwest Division. That was the borough, all the surrounding Roos, and down to Nayland. And at that time, Trevor Kelway was clerk of Roos and Milford Haven, and he was also coroner, and he was registrar of the court. He retired from the Magistrates' Court in 1955, and I took over from him. And that's when I first had a salary. Until then I hadn't got a salary, it was just a job. But I worked then always in 12 High Street, and when the amalgamation in 1955, Oliver and Miss Nicholson, who were clerks to Kelway, moved up into 12 High Street. And we had the office there for 20 odd years. And then in March of 1955, I also took over Milford Haven. So I had then the west part of Pembrokeshire.
Thinking of the years then, once things had amalgamated,
yes.
Were you more busy then?
Yes, when we were amalgamated, Rees used to sit in Saturday. Well, we stopped the Saturday and we sat every Monday in the shower hall, and we used to run 2 courts. And I used to go, then we had the court in Milford on a Wednesday. Milford was odd in a way. The court in Milford always sat in the afternoon. And that was the reason they didn't, it wasn't convenient in Milford to sit until the fish had been loaded, because most of the magistrates and people worked on the fish market. So it was convenient then for to start in the afternoon. Well, that suited me because I had the morning in the office. And I found the afternoon was, there was no end to the afternoon. You went on until you finished. Whereas in the morning you had to adjourn for lunch.
They didn't adjourn for tea?
No, we went straight on to be finished.
Yes. And what about cases in Haverfordwest? Do any cases that may have appeared before the magistrate stick in your mind, or do you recall as being in any way unusual? Or?
Well, one of the ones that went along, in the end, you remember they prosecuted Walter Barrett as the county architect. Well, that fell flat because they took about 10 years to get it organised. But really, I was very lucky in Haverfordwest. All my time, we never had any very serious crime. No. I mean, I never had a murder or a manslaughter or anything very serious. Mostly motoring offences and larceny. Matter of fact, for the whole 30 years, I had a very easy time in the courts. There was nothing very controversial.
Were there any drunken offences?
Oh yes, we got regular there. And in the early days, whenever anybody applied for an extension of hours for the pubs, all the non-conformist ministers used to attend court and object.
So how did those turn out normally? I suppose there's been a tendency to go towards more and more licensing.
Yes, things got very much easier as time went on, and then after a bit nobody objected to it. They objected to extension of hours for various functions, but it got more relaxed as time went on. And originally, it was pretty. There's a great move rather against it from the churches, but by the time I finished, they never bothered to attend.
And which various chairmen did you work with later on?
Then later on, we had 2, Dick Wade and Jim John. Dick Wade was the Camrose man, and Jim John was Langham. Now, in those days, we used to have to watch any Langham case came before Jim John was easy, and any Camrose sort of area from Jim John got clobbered, and the reverse happened when Dick Wade was in, and there was a great sort of competition between the two, who would be chairman. Well, when they finished, we settled down more then. Colonel Hagan became chairman, and he was a good chairman, and the bench went very well then for many years. And when he retired, we had Hugh Davis, and he was another good chairman. I mean, they were very good chairmen. They ran a good court.
Would you feel the court was always a very efficient one?
What?
Would you feel the court was an efficient and a fair one?
Oh yes. No, as we used to sit in the shower hall, the main hall, the court number 1, and then we had the sessions room upstairs. And by the time I finished, they did the extension with the 3rd court. That was never a very popular court around there. And when we had the new court, and we went upstairs, we didn't often sit in the shower hall then. The main hall.
So, were you glad to retire or nostalgic when you did finally? When you finally retired, you were 76, 78.
I retired in March of '79, by which time I'd also taken over clerkships of all the south of the county. And in about 1972, 1942, I was appointed clerk instead of John James, who died, for Tenby, Pembroke and Narberth, and I had to go full-time then. And for 3.5 years I was a full-time clerk. But they were very good to me in the Magistrates' Courts Committee. They allowed me to remain as a consultant in my old firm, and I had never really moved from my office.
I'm going to ask you now about two of your antecedents.
Yes.
Because we gather you're descended from Admiral Lord Stokes and from Sir John Fortune, but of course there was a connection there, I believe, and the two families joined in marriage.
My great-grandfather was George Warren Stokes. He went to India and he became a colonel in the Indian Army. And my grandmother was born in India. Now, George Warren Stokes married, I think she was Elizabeth Fortune, who was the daughter of William Fortune. Her mother was a Savoury who came from Devon, and her parents were married in Somerset. I think they were quite prosperous people in the south.
So, do you have any childhood memories of any of the descendants of either Stokes or Fortune or both?
I can remember Mrs. Sampson, who was the daughter of the Admiral, and we were always very friendly with the Sampson family. Now, my grandmother's brother was Charles Stokes. He was a solicitor in Tenby, and I remember him because we used to go over a lot and have tea with his daughter Nellie Stokes, who lived in Warren Street, Tenby. She never married. I remember we used to go over there regularly.
So can you tell us then about these two family portraits?
Yes, well that was my great-grandfather, George Warren Stokes. He was a colonel in the Indian Army, and that was his wife, who was she was a Fortune. She was Elizabeth Fortune.
So what relation was George Warren Stokes then to the Admiral?
Brother.
Brother, right, yeah.
Brother. I think he was the elder brother, but why he didn't go into Scotchwell, I don't know. He died in Tenby eventually, not very old.
And then his wife then, as you say, was a Fortune?
She was a Fortune. She was a daughter of William Fortune of Lewisham. Her father would have been quite an interesting, because I've got a long story he wrote. In 1842, he went to Bristol by boat from Milford Haven, and then went on to London. The extraordinary thing was, he then went to Windsor and Eton, and it turned out that he went to Eton in 1820. Extraordinary that a man from here went there.
Well, yes.
Now,
and so what relation was she to Sir John Fortune? How many generations apart?
there never was a Sir John Fortune.
Oh no, who was the...
They were all mostly William Fortune. Yes, yes, and they were quite prominent in the town. I think the Fortunes were bankers. Yes. And you remember, one of them was killed in a duel.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
On what they call the Floric now. It's very often called Fortune's Floric.
Yeah.
But they were killed in a duel.
That's right. Yeah. So which was that? Was that the grandfather of your?
No, he would have been probably an uncle.
An uncle, yes. Yeah. So
it's in the little book there, all about it.
So obviously there's dueling blood in your family, you know? Fighting blood.
The sad part is today he recovered immediately.
Yes, yeah.
But not in those days.
No, of course. Yes.
I do want to say this one here. But
yes.
Now this was a photograph of my grandfather, Edward Eaton Evans, who was also a solicitor, and that was taken in 12 High Street. And the chair he's sitting in, I've got in my office now. I sit in it.
Yes.
And this was a very poor photograph of my grandfather and my grandmother taken in Avellino.
Ah, yes, yes.
It shows how they went.
Yes.
And as a matter of interest, this was a cup that was given to my great-grandfather William Evans, the man who lived in Avellino. It was given him by the people in the town. He conducted some trial. He was also interested in the building of the new bridge and the Shah Hall. It's in 1834, that was.
Ah, right, yes.
Goes back a bit.
That goes back a long way, yes.
Here we are.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's a fascinating insight into an old family.
Oh, well.
So thank you very much indeed.
There you are. If you want any more information, let me know.
Yes, right. Jack Holt has a wealth of memories of early days in Prendergast and its Bull Inn, reaching nearly, but not quite, back to the time when the village had its own unofficial mayor. He told us of the high street shops in the 1920s, his working life in the post office, and of his days playing in dance bands.
Well, there was a lot of old characters in Haverfordwest. We'd start off with Prendergast. There was an old chap and his wife, Short Annie and Billy Buskin. And old Billy used to get drunk at nights coming home here, and the people used to go out and shout to him, "Billy can't mow a field of potatoes." And he'd take his walking stick and throw his walking stick at the people then. And that'd be perhaps about 6 o'clock, and we'd go up to Prendergast Workmen's Club, where we were allowed to join at 14, and he'd still been in the horse and groom or the bull, and the people were still out shouting after him, "Billy can't mow," and who put the blanket on the rhubarb. And his wife then used to come home a lot later. She was a short little woman, and they were two old characters in Prendergast. And then there's some other ones that I didn't know, but I've heard my father talk about them. For my father's people kept the bull. In fact, my father and his 4 brothers was born in the bull in Prendergast. And W.D. Phillips was my grandmother's brother, the one that wrote the book about old Haverfordwest. And Dad used to say that after his father died, but Dad was 6 months old when his father died, and my grandmother then had to get out of the bull. They wouldn't even keep the bull on. But Dad was one of the early drivers in Haverfordwest. The first car that come here for Bland's for hire was a 1905 Argyle, and Mr. John Andrew Bland then and my father went up to Poyston. They owned Poyston. I think Dad drove the pony and trap and Mr. Bland drove the car, and Dad had to learn to drive this car by the book and go round the field. And he said, I went round the field, and Mr. Bland said, "Oh, you take it back," for Bland's garage in those days was at the bottom of Prendergast on the Bridge End Square. And Dad said, I went to work, and he said, I had to go to the Castle Hotel, and I think the Blands, some people, a relative of them owned the castle, and he had to drive 5 cattle dealers to St. David's, and he'd never change gear, only in the field, so he had 15 miles and 16 hills to contend with.
Did they still have the mayor of Prendergast in your day? Or?
No, the last mayor in Prendergast was Cable Williams in 1911. I got some photos in the house here, some of them. My grandmother's uncle Tom got wounded in the Crimean War, in the Battle of Alma, and there was a few Haverfordwest men went to fight in the Crimean War, and Uncle Tom got wounded in the Battle of Alma, and the soldiers was billeted round here in those days as militia, and the officers in charge come up to see him after coming home from the Crimean War, and he said, Mrs. Phillips, that was my grandmother's grandmother, said, right, drink the house dry tonight, everybody. So they drank the bull dry. That was twice.
So what businesses do you remember around town, in the body of the town itself, in those early days?
Well, we can start in High Street. Miss Skay's Lloyd had a shop just where the crypt is now. Then there was Llewellyn Phillips. They had a milliner shop there. Then Jack Devereux went in part of it at one time selling records. And then there was 7 High Street was Freddie Harris. Then was the Borough Stores, which is called now, it was in the paper this week.
Was the new restaurant?
That's right, down there. Then 13 High Street was Ocky White, which I got a photo of that year.
Yes.
And further down was Smith and Sons. Then there was Rees Brothers first, then Ballers. Then there was the East Shop was there. Then there was Cash and Co.
So
then,
nearly all of these were local?
Yes, all local. And then there was True's. And then S.P. Morris. And then there's Mrs. White from Husbandson had a butcher shop there, and people used to flock there at nights for homemade faggots. And then further down there was Buckingham House, Mrs. Bucky Jones, I think she was a pianist. And of course there was a Midland Bank. And then there was Fred Munt. And then S&F Green and the Shire Hall.
So High Street would have been very busy in those days?
Yes, of course it was. And then there was K Street, W.J. John. I got a photo of them here. And then Mr. Phillips, the Castle Square. Mr. Phillips and Greens, they started the Welsh Autocar Company. And Sir Hugh Thomas. And then they built a place on the track then, which was called Greens, they had in K Street then. Then they had the Welsh Autocar Company, and my dad was very friendly with Hugh Thomas. He was then lived in the Grove House in Hill Street, on St Thomas Green. And he always wanted Dad to come and work for him, but Dad didn't want to be a gardener and then I got a chauffeur. But he used to, Sir Hugh had 2 cars, about 1906. And Dad used to drive one for him on Pendine on some speed trials. And my brother and I used to pull my father's leg. We used to say, Dad, did you ever turn your cap back to front when he was driving those cars? And then, of course, Sir Hugh Thomas died then, a young man. You know about it well. No, he went to Castle Hall in Milford.
Yes. Before we come on to your days playing in the band, I think you said your first job was in the post office.
Yes.
So can you tell us a little about this?
Yeah, I tell you a lot about that. We started as Italian boy. There was 3 of us, Italian boys, and we start work at 8 o'clock in the morning one week till 5.
And this was at the top of High Street then?
Top High Street, and we had a half day on a Saturday. The next 2 shifts was 9:30 in the morning till 7:30 at night, and no half day that week. And if a telegram come at 7:30 at night with a 3-mile radius, you had to go with them. Overtime then. How much do you think we had?
You tell me.
We cycled to Johnson. We've sketched the pop people in Johnson, Lewis Mohay and Colin Merchant, and Kenneth Walker Bolson, 3pence. And Kenneth Walker, he lived in Bolson in the manor there. And he had an Overland car, something, my father had one, something similar after. And Kenneth had a motto on the back, a musket, and like this, a red devil going like this. And he had an argument with the poster because over 3 mile, we had to charge him 3pence. But Kenneth reckoned he was under the 3 mile. And we'd go out there with a telegram, up the steps, Kenneth would come, take the telegram, any reply, we had to take any replies back then, see. No, he said, but you're 3pence for the honest man, that was a tip for us, and 6pence for the bloody robbers. That's what he called the poosters. he was a real well-known character. He used to have horses, used to race him at the point-to-points. So there was another character in the town.
What was the postal service like in those days?
Excellent. Only we didn't have much money for it. But then after I was a Tarringham boy, we all had to take the civil service exam, and if you didn't pass that, you were chucked out. And then if you passed, you could go in high marks. You had SC&T, sorting clerk and telegraphist. Otherwise, then you could go on engineers, and then you'd fail that, you went on the postman. Well, engineers, we all wanted to go on because it was a better job and more pay. But Frank John, he was there with me. His people kept the plough and harrow. Now Frank was just ahead of me, and when he passed out, then he was sent to Cardiff. There was no arguing. You lose your job, or you went to Cardiff to work. And of course, we was only having about 30 shillings a week, and lodging was about £1.5. So he didn't have much money, but what they allowed us to do, put in for a transfer. If anybody retired in Haverfordwest, you could come back. Well, my lot was up to Lettison, and I had to be up there at 6:30 in the morning. And then I come back then after I've been up there doing the town duties, and then they put their own vans on then, because Bland's and Griffith City Road was the contractors for the post office. And the mail was met in the morning at 6 o'clock, and then we used to go out to the vans. My run was up to Newport Pem and Crosscoke and St David's, but people, the vans weren't delivering in those days. There was men on bicycles, part-time postmen, and they go around, and every delivery was finished by about 12 o'clock. But in the town ones, you'd start at 6, you go to the station, unload the mail on the other side of the platform. You had to pull the trucks across, put them in the mail vans, unload, back at the post office, and then go out on your delivery.
So when did you first get into music and playing in bands? How did this
Well, my brother was very musical from an early age, so I've heard my parents say that, because when just after the First World War, they had a prisoner of war camp up at Schurzhoek. And the German band used to come down here playing, and they used to say Norman was only a youngster. He used to come in here and play one finger, the tune that they were playing. And then when we got older, we both had music lessons, and Norman used to go up to Brennigus Club Room, sixpenny hops. And then the West Camlin come now for the West then, and Cecil Parcel, Emlyn Bevan, and Luther Matthias, and my brother and I started playing in the dance band then. My brother really and Cecil Parsons started the band going. And then there was one chap who used to come in at nights when he was working, I used to play. And then he was from the Farmers Arms in Haverfordwest. And then Cecil went away, and my brother went away in 1934. And left me carry the can then with the band. So we had Joffre Swales in then to play a saxophone and the violin. So Joff stayed with us until about 1936 when the County Theatre finished. The pianist we had there was either she was going to get married or courting, and then we all went our own ways then.
And what about the dances then? And say in the years just after the war then, 1940s, it obviously picked up very quickly after that.
After the war, yes. Because as I said, you could have 1,000 people in the Market Hall on a Saturday night. And then the drill hall used to be packed out. We used to play there and up in Tracoon. And then when my brother went from here, he played for one of the big bands in Cardiff. And Howard Jones was the singer there. The crooner, they called him in those days. Then he went from the band my brother playing in, he went to Ambrose, and then he went to Julos, and I had a recording off the String of Pearls on a Sunday morning with him singing the old Lamplighter.
Yes, so, and you mentioned dances were on from 9 till 3.
Well, it never went till 3, not in the County Theatre, no. The Saturday nights, wherever we played, 11:45, last dance and out. Same out the country, but mostly in the week they had dances years ago. They didn't have so many down here till after the war. Then they started having Saturday nights. And Commander Orford, then I played a lot for him. He used to,
Richards was for decades one of a remarkable group of local newspapermen. Haverfordwest has a tradition of mighty characters in the press, reporters, editors and proprietors, and Bill Richards, in a career spanning half a century, much of it as senior reporter on the West Wales Guardian, knew all of these men. He is talking here to fellow journalist Derek Rees.
We were talking about getting into town on bicycles in those days.
Yes, that's right. Everybody out our way anyway came into Haverfordwest on bicycles, and went home carrying parcels and all on bikes, you know, which was great. And it gave you plenty of freedom to come and go whenever you pleased, although there was a good bus service. And this operated mainly on a Saturday, and people came into town for, well, I don't really know what they came for except to parade around town. This was a great recreation before the television, to walk around town on a Saturday night, and the girls a bit, you know, but the girls used to do the same, and this was a recreation, walking around town on Saturday night. And this would happen until about 10 o'clock, when there was a bus out to St David's, and we all went home then. And that was what we had to be satisfied with, and were satisfied with.
Yeah.
So different from today.
Yes. Did the bus go into Camrose itself, or was it on the road?
No, the bus was from Haverfordwest to St David's, and stopped at Keaton Hill, for as far as I was concerned.
Yeah.
And it made frequent stops, and lots of people from out our way travelled on the bus, which was a recognised thing, a regular thing.
Yeah. And some, of course, had to walk a mile, half a mile. Probably.
Yes, well, I did. I had to walk about a mile from the bus stop to my home.
Yeah.
But this was nothing. It was an accepted thing. It was understood.
Yeah.
And this happened late at night, and everybody did it.
Yeah.
Nobody was afraid of walking in the dark in those days.
No. But did they stay in Haverfordwest in the evenings, sometimes entertainment? You know?
Well, there was very little entertainment apart from the cinema. We all went to cinema in those days. I'm talking now about the early 30s.
Yeah.
And the talkies had only come in a few years before, and were extremely popular. And the two cinemas in Haverfordwest were always full every Saturday night. And we all went to the cinema. Enjoyed the talkies, and then walked around town a bit, and went home again. You know, it is.
Which cinemas were those now?
Well, it was the Palace Theatre, which is still there. I don't know how much it operates these days, but the Palace Theatre was very popular, and there was a cinema at the old Temperance Hall, which is next to the Liberal Club.
Yeah.
And that was a very small cinema, but it was extremely popular, especially with the courting couples, because it had very convenient seats at the back. And there were lots of courting going on there, and lots of funny noises, apart from the talkies themselves. But this was, you know, this is what happened.
That was Daddy White's cinema, was it?
Daddy White, yes, that's right.
Was it his then?
Yes, he, well, in about, I don't know, 30s, for early 30s, Daddy White owned it, and during the 20s, of course. But in 1934, I think it was, when R.G. Note took it over. Guy Note took over the. He had the two cinemas in Haverfordwest, and that's where it remained until for a few years, until the West of England cinemas came along and bought all of the cinema places in this area. Well, certainly in Haverfordwest, anyway.
Yeah. And of course, 1935, I think the county was built, wasn't it?
The county was built in 1935, that's right. And of course was extremely popular, full every night. Yeah. Everybody went to cinema in those days.
Yeah.
People from every house, fathers, mothers, the lot, all went in turn to the cinema.
Yeah. And a significant thing for you, I think, who opened that cinema, because he was Mayor of Haverfordwest at the time.
It was Mr. Hammond.
Yeah.
Gabriel Hammond opened it. That's right. He was Mayor of Haverfordwest. Yeah. And this gave us a little bit of pride, because he was our employer, our boss, and a very popular man he was too, although he was very strict and a bit, could be severe, but he was a good man, good sportsman as well.
Now he's the man who appointed you. Tell us about that, then.
Well, my old schoolmaster out in Camel South was a man called Mr. R.T. Griffiths, and he was friendly with Mr. Hammond, who was the owner and editor of The Guardian, mainly through sport. Mr. Griffiths had been a soccer player and got to know Mr. Hammond, and Mr. Griffiths must have considered me worthy of being recommended, and he wrote a letter which he gave to me and asked me to deliver it to Mr. Hammond. And I went into Haverfordwest one day and saw Mr. Hammond, gave him the letter, and he read it, and he asked me a few questions, and then he said, well, all right, then he said, will you start next Monday? And that's how I started work in The Guardian. And that was towards the end of 1929. And my first job was to write the wrappers for the newspapers which were sent away every week all over the country. And there were hundreds of them, actually. So it was quite a job, and it took me most of the day to do it, actually. Yeah.
But J.W. was a great character, wasn't he?
Oh, he was a fine chap. He was he'd spent his life in newspapers. He started as a printer originally in Dorset, in his home county of Dorset. But he was he must have been a bright boy, because he became a journalist and worked on the Books Free Press for some few years, and then he came down to Pembrokeshire, and he arrived in Haverfordwest on Portfield Fair Day in 1894, aged 22 years, and to work on The Guardian, which was then printed in Salva, and needed an experienced journalist in the county town of Haverfordwest, and J.W. Hammer was the man who had the job. And of course, actually, he didn't think much of it in the beginning, and he thought that he wouldn't be here long, but eventually he stayed and for 60 odd years, and became well, as you know, a leading citizen in Pembrokeshire, not only in Haverfordwest but throughout Pembrokeshire.
Yeah.
In my 60 years.
When you joined
Yes,
The
that's
Guardian,
right.
what sort of jobs did you have apart from doing the wrappers? You obviously went around the town and met people.
Oh, yes. My first reporting jobs were in Haverfordwest, and mainly collecting news paragraphs from the town. And this involved me going around all the preachers and parsons in the town, which is rather laughable now, but it was done, and I did it for years, 3 or 4 years anyway. And I used to go knock on the doors and say, from The Guardian, and they soon got to know, and they all soon got to realise the value of local publicity. And the result of this was that I was welcomed wherever I went, really. And they were all very kind to me, and I enjoyed myself no end. And these calls were usually made on a Thursday, the day before The Guardian was published. The mid-editions in Haverfordwest were published on a Friday morning. And this meant that Thursday was always my busy day. And I spent the whole of the morning and first part of the afternoon making my calls on all the preachers and parsons in the town, and I spent the late afternoon and evenings writing up my news. Yes, and this was great. I enjoyed it. It was a good experience, and I got to know a lot of people.
So pencil and paper then?
Oh, absolutely. Well,
Typewriters?
No typewriters. I can't use a typewriter now, except very slowly, because I never had to use a typewriter. Yeah. It was all writing
on copy paper.
Yes. And I always used a pencil and not a pen.
Yes.
And this was accepted, And although I said myself, the line of type operators who would have set this into type, always liked seeing my copy. I was glad of that.
Yeah. Well, you had lovely handwriting. You're also a good shorthand writer, weren't you? You won't say it yourself, I know.
No, I won't. Yes, well, I was told by Mr. Hammer when I started work that I'd have to, first of all, I'd have to live in town in Haverfordwest. That was number one, because I was living out in the country. And the second thing was that I had to learn shorthand. Well, I moved into live in town. I didn't have much difficulty about that because I knew people in town, and I went into lodgings with them. Then, as far as the short run was concerned, I went to a man called Robert Owen in City Road, who had quite a school of shorthand students. And I joined this lot and learned shorthand with Robert Owen. And he was very good, although the drawback about it was that he wouldn't take speed exams. So I couldn't take the speed exam, but I learned the theory of shorthand with Robert Owen. And I was very glad because it stood me in good stead later on, because I became the official shorthand writer to the bankruptcy court, which made me a lot of money.
But you've developed your writing since you've retired, haven't you? I know you did write 1 or 2 books before you retired, but...
Yeah, well, I was in Pembroke during the air raids, and I thought that after when the war finished that, well, first of all, we couldn't do much reporting of the air raids at the time during the war because of the restrictions, the censorship. But when the war was over, I thought it would make a good story, so I wrote a series of articles about the air raids on Pembrokeshire, mostly Pembroke, of course. And when that was over, I thought, well, or I believe somebody suggested, was it Hector Hammond or not? But somebody said it would make a good story, a book. So I developed it a bit and made a book out of it called Pembrokeshire Under Fire. And that came out about, I don't know, a few years after the war. And I did write a few books after that, our local small books.
But you've written quite a few since you've retired, haven't you? How many have you written altogether?
8, I think.
Yeah. Haverfordwest My Grandstand?
Yeah. Oh, no.
History of the Hospital?
The County Hospital story.
Golf Club? What was it called?
Yeah, Haverfordwest Golf. I'm forgetting what I wrote now. Yes, Grandstand, Hospital stories, Golf Club. What else?
Rose, recent one?
Oh yeah, that's right. Well, that's yes, that's done. That was done a few months ago.
Yeah. But at 15, you had to grow up very quickly, didn't you?
Oh, you're right into it straight away, like Yes. Though I found that the Hammond family were quite remarkable. They occupied an influential position in Haverfordwest, especially the father, J. Hammond, and they needn't have bothered much with a person like me, a junior just starting work, but they were exceptionally kind. They were very good. Doris Hammond, who became Mrs. Price, Mrs. Bill Price, was lovely, and so was her sister Nora. They were very good, and Leo Hammond was the eldest son. Was all right. He was worked in the works in the Guardian, and he was an excellent engineer. He had a gift for engineering, marvelous thing. And so J. Hammond, his father, let him look after the printing side, the engineering side of the business, and he did it marvelously well, But the one I had most to do with, of course, was Hector Hammond, who was J. Hammond's second son, and who was a barrister. He went to grammar school, obviously, and went to Aberystwyth University where he studied law, got a law degree, and then spent a few years in Gray's Inn in London.
To go back to J.W., he was a man who loved big cars, wasn't he?
Yes, he certainly did.
And speed.
Yeah, he started off as a reporter when he was a young man with a motorbike. So I'm told. I can't remember those days, but he had a motorbike and was going all over the county on this motorbike. When he prospered a bit and got a bit of money, he bought a motor car, and then he had another car, and he had another car. And he had a series of cars. All of which, they became bigger and bigger as the years went by. He had a bigger car and a bigger car, and he ended up with an Oldsmobile, which was a huge American job, And he used to drive around the county in that old mobile when he was about 80 years of age, going like the devil, you know. And everybody standing back, is Jaded Brew coming? This is quite funny now to look back at, you know. But he had this reputation.
Yeah. Do you remember a story about him with a couple more octogenarians coming down Arnold's Hill at great speed? Remember that, Jack Window?
Yeah, I've heard.
Charlie Quack.
Yes, that's right. They all wanted to get out and walk. And W.H. John of Solva, who was a printer in Solva and connected, well, he ran the Guardian at a branch in Solva, the paper having started in Solva, and this branch carried on, and W.H. John ran the Guardian office in Solva. And J.W. was out there one day, and W.H. John was going into town, and he said, well, come with me, Mr. John, you can have a lift in, you can catch the bus. So John went with Hammond, and of course they came in at a furious speed. And when Hammond stopped in High Street and said, there we are, Mr. John, you're in Haverfordwest now. Yes, he said, I'm in Haverfordwest now. He said, but never again with you.
Have you noticed, has Haverfordwest changed significantly since you first came in to town as a boy?
Well, yes, there have been many changes, of course. When I came to Haverfordwest as a boy, the great thing was the Saturday market. You know, Saturday was market day, and all the people from the country came into town on Saturdays, on bicycles or walking, or in pony trams. Not many cars about then, not compared with today. And Saturday was a very busy day. The rest of the week was fairly quiet, and Thursday was a very quiet day, because it was half day, and it really was half day. At 12 or 1 o'clock, all the businesses closed down, and the place was deserted. In the summer, people all went down to the seaside, mostly Broadhaven. They used to call Broadhaven Haverfordwest by sea on Thursdays, and Newgall, of course, and anywhere. And it's very, very quiet. I knew this, and it was most noticeable to me because on Thursday I covered the Haverfordwest paragraph. I was to go on and the place was deserted, and I would call on no end of people. No answer. All, you know, and it was very frustrating. But it just meant that in those days the half day really was half day, and everywhere closed.
But Market Street was very busy, particularly on a Saturday, wasn't it?
Market Street was busy, especially on Saturday, as you say, because the market was there and was a centre of activity, and all the country people came into Haverfordwest and went to the market, and the result was that Market Street was one of the prosperous areas of Haverfordwest. And they had shops there like Commerce House, which is a big business. Big business.
Yes. I was going to mention Commerce House because that was a sort of emporium, a sort of Harrods of Haverfordwest, wasn't it?
It was. That's a very good way of describing it. It was the Harrods of Haverfordwest, and employed many staff, girls mostly, and some men as well, but mostly girls. My sister was there. She learned her trade as a milliner, of all things, in Commerce House. And spent 5 years when you learn their trade as a milliner. And there were lots of, it was a real, a bone after Commerce House, because it employed so many people. And it's amazing to think that that's all gone now. Everything is gone completely.
And the gentry used to come into town, didn't they, from the various estates and go to Commerce House for their clothing for the grand occasions in the assembly rooms.
Yes, that's right, they did. That's right. It was a big business. Renish and Dawkins ran Commerce House. And I didn't know Renish, but I remember old Dawkins. You can remember him, probably, can you? Yes. Funny chap he was too. And then after Rennish and Dawkins' day, John Nicholas ran Commerce House. Do you remember him?
I heard of
He was a local man from Portable Bolson, all places, and he went away to work as a young man and gained some must have been very good experience in business in London or in the London area, I think, and came back here as the managing director of Commerce House, and he was a real live wire, and he ran Commerce House as a good business, you know, and he was on the ball. John Nicholas was, and he became a town councillor, and was a very highly esteemed man. There's no doubt about that. We used to make fun of him in many ways, you know. They used to laugh about him because he was so sharp and such a quick mover and all, you know. He was a character, but he was good. He was good, yes.
Talking about Market Street, Portfield Fair and the Mayfair were very, very much bigger in those days, weren't they, in the 30s? And
oh yes. Oh, Portfield Fair was an event in the Haverfordwest calendar. It was a big event, and hundreds and hundreds of people came into town for Portfield Fair, always, for years and years. And this went on long after the last war, you know. And then after several years it began to tail off, and now it's gone to nothing, like, more or less. But in the 20s and 30s, Portfield Fair was the big event in Haverfordwest, the big annual event.
what about Billy Jacks? Could we mention Billy Jacks?
Oh, Billy Jacks was an outstanding man, in my opinion. He didn't have a great background. He went to grammar school and had a good certificate, I know that. And then went to work on the Pembrokeshire Herald first. Then the war came and Billy Jacks went into the army and incidentally became the youngest sergeant in the British Army. Did you know?
First World War.
Yeah, First World War. Did you know that?
I didn't know that.
Yes, he was the youngest sergeant. And he was very sharp mentally. He was quite a clever chap, and I had a tremendous admiration for him in his work. And I knew him as well as anybody because I worked alongside him for 20 years or more, I suppose. And by God, he took a bit of keeping up with now. Billy Jacks did. He was very, very good, and he could have held a job anywhere, including in Fleet Street. Matter of fact, it is a great tragedy. He didn't go to Fleet Street because he would have had a top job. I'm sure he would have had a top job in Fleet Street. He was of that standard, a very able man. We used to go to the county council, and as you know, that was a big thing to cover. The county council, it went on all day to start with, and covering all areas of the county and various matters, various things which were dealt with. And Billy Jacks would be there working like a beaver all day long, and when the county council finished, very often he'd finished his write-up as well, and was columns of stuff, and not many people could do it.
Well, thank you for giving us this opportunity.
Oh, good heavens above, that's all right.
We couldn't miss a person like you out for
Oh, good.
You've been a journalist in Haverfordwest for 70 odd years, and you're still writing.
Yeah, I'm still writing a bit, and I've got plans to write, a bit more if the health holds out. This is the thing now.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
Joffre Swales started playing the violin when he was 6, and aside from his career in the county offices, has been a distinctive presence on the town's musical scene for decades. He He has played in numerous bands, coached hundreds of pupils, and directed first the Mary Immaculate Band and later the Town and County Youth Band. He really is Haverfordwest's Mr. Music. Well, with me this morning is Joffre Swales, who I think needs no introduction at all. He's known everywhere as Haverfordwest Mr. Music. But I'm going to talk to him a little this morning about the early memories of the town, some of the characters he remembers over the years. And I think I'll start, Joffre, by asking you, what probably are the earliest people and places you remember in the town?
Well, I would think I was almost 6 years of age when I decided to move from my family house in Portfield, which was rather full at that time. I decided to go down and live with an old great uncle and aunt. He was born, I think, in 1854 or 6, and lived in Merlin's Hill. And I asked if I could live with them, which I did for, I think, about 5 years. So I was right in the middle of the fishing community of Merlin's Hill. The upper part of Merlin's Hill, where the fire station is now, consisted almost entirely of fishermen. And then there was the Ivy Cottage nearby, where they all adjourned when they came in for about 24 hours and back to sea again. A great crowd of people always shared their fish out that they carried home, shared it out. And then there were also there a man who trapped moles on the racecourse, Tommy Boyne. He was a very interesting character. And then the great thing there was that on every Tuesday was the big cattle market. So the whole of Merlin's Hill was full of cattle, and St Thomas Green. And up above us, we're now, how can I put it, just above the Stonemasons Arms, the big circular place, roundabout. In that area was the horse fair. And then I could watch from the window as these cattle sales were going on, all the arguing and so on, and these cattle drovers who brought the cattle in. Going through the town, all those cattle would be on foot, of course. Quite a mess in the town, but occasional bulls racing away. Quite a lot of thrills like that. In fact, I remember a bull escaping from the market hall where they had the big Xmas there. It escaped, and they tied it to a lamppost, and the poor thing broke its horn. And then it got away and ran and was caught right outside the slaughterhouse, conveniently for the people there. But it was a place of great characters and smells.
What sort of smells?
Well, apart from the animal smell, all the animals going, and the dung was quickly removed, horse dung or horse manure. That was used for gardens, and my aunt used it for planting roses. She gave me a bucket and spade. If a horse passed down, I filled the bucket and she put it on the roses, you see. One could stand in the road quite safely those days and do that sort of thing. And then everyone had their allotment opposite our place in Merlin's Hill, all that field, now occupied by very nice houses. That was a big allotment where the men met every night and conversed in between their digging. And you heard all the stories of the Boer War then. Not that I did in the 1920s. Stories of the Boer War. The other smells were from some lovely shops. For instance, Bowler's in High Street here, halfway down High Street. One could smell the ground coffee, well, from 50 yards away, I guess, and smoked bacon. Just really smoked bacon, very dark, and beautiful flavour, and all the men in their white aprons, getting the coffee and the bacon with a big machine for the bacon. And at the back then, Mr. Bowler, he was a famous corgi breeder, world famous. And he also, at one time, had a fox in the back there. There was also a great Sealy ham breeder in Haverfordwest, world famous, Mr. Fred Lewis, who lived where Mr. McEntee is now, by the Dale Road.
Was there, you mentioned the cattle trading and the horses.
Yes.
Was there much strong drink to be had at these occasions?
Yes, but no violence with it. The great thing that I remember about these fairs and so on was the sound. That was even when I was about 3 years of age. I recall this when I was in Portfield living. One would be woken by the sound of these horses and carts going up at midnight and afterwards. And the old farmer would have commenced from Dew Street, maybe lit, he had a candle in this glass box, but that would probably been extinguished by the time he got to Portfield in the wind. But all the horses seemed to find their way home, no trouble. My wife, in fact, she had an uncle who farmed on the hill at Goodick, and he used to come into the Fishgood Arms here after he'd been engaged in the fair, in the cattle fair, and then he'd get on his horse cart rather, on the cart, and the horse would safely bring him asleep all the way from Haverfordwest to Goodick. He's told me that. He'd sleep all the way. No danger from cars or anything.
Were there any motor cars
different world
at all? Or?
Very few. And they moved very slowly. For instance, I know my wife's mother, they could afford a car. And they had a big, I think it was a Lagonda. And she learned to drive in bottom gear, but learned no other gear. She drove in bottom gear everywhere. So there was no great speed.
No.
Mr. Fred Lewis, who I mentioned at the telegraph, a great Sealy ham breeder, he used to ride up Portfield on a motorcycle at about, almost walking speed. We used to trot at his side from the top of Barn Street, the boys, right to his place on the Dale Road, holding a conversation with him. He had a BSA motorbike.
And you were going slightly uphill as well?
Yes, yes. Oh, you just trotted along there. No speed, no danger.
No, very troublesome.
This is a different world now.
Right.
Yeah.
What was your first job when you left school? Where did you go?
My brother, he was given an egg a day when he commenced work in the county offices. My mother kept telling me I'd get an egg a day if I went there, just the incentive. So I entered this entrance exam and was successful. And I worked in the county offices in the finance department for a number of years, and in the internal audit department also, until the war broke out.
So how many people worked in the county offices in those days compared with nowadays, perhaps?
I would think about 30. And they had all the departments there. Education, land agent, the agricultural and horticultural and poultry advisors, the Representation of the People Act, local taxation, motor car licenses, everything was included there. And a great body of people to work with.
Yes, yeah. Did they impress you as being very skillful and expert?
Oh yes. The man in charge of the finance department had left school when he was barely 14. He'd become a messenger boy at the Shire Hall. Then they'd taken him in the finance department, and his calligraphy, his handwriting and balancing of ledgers was fantastic. And then he passed, you see, no one passed exams in accountancy. He passed that knowledge on to Mr. George Hughes, who became county treasurer afterwards. George Hughes, the son of the father of David Hughes.
Yeah.
After the war, when I went back for a short time to the county offices, And they made me then acting master of the workhouse for 9 months.
Oh, the workhouse was still?
Oh yes, until 1948 when the National Health Service came.
Yes.
And the reason why I had to go down there was because no master, no, how can I say, it was a job for master and matron. But they had realised, all these qualified people, that it was going out, workhouses were going out, so they were moving into other spheres of work, you see. So they couldn't find a master, so I went down there for 9 months.
So what were the inmates like? What sort of people found their way there?
Well, I used to have a chat with the old men and so on in the lunch hour very often. We'd, I must mention on Saturdays, halfway through the morning, there'd be an issue of tobacco to all these inmates. And the porter, the workhouse porter, would line them up. And he'd march forward, and I'd hand him an ounce of tobacco. And then after all these old men would come the old ladies. Half a crown for each. Now put that under your pillow, my dear, because you may lose it. There's quite a bit of trouble in the cash side.
So were there many residents still left in the workhouse when the National Health started?
Oh, it was full. Yes, yes. And also as a children's home, of course, adjoining. And that I was responsible for that also. And the food, accounts, clothing, everything.
So what took you into music in the first place? Was it something you always wanted?
Well, this was something that I had to work with. You see, when I was doing that work, the music, I had to work the music with it, with a consequent lack of sleep. But the reason it happened, when I lived on the Merlin's Hill with my old uncle, he bought me a little wooden flute. It was about so big. What they call a transverse flute or fife. And then I got a book from Mackenzie's and I worked out how music was written. I had to do it all myself. But then, after a couple of years, I was about 8 years of age, and I realised that all the music was in St Mary's Church for boys. They had a marvellous choir of about 40 at least there, men and boys. So I went there where Mr. Bishop was the organist, a lovely man. And he gave me some lessons on the violin, but he also obtained the grammar school flute, a concert flute for me, so I could play in the orchestra there. He could see that I was very keen. And I continued singing for him in the choir until I was 18. And when my voice broke, I continued singing male alto for him, which was the only alto part. Of course, we don't get female alto, so I was able to continue singing for him. My voice broke in a lucky place.
Yes. So was there much in the 30s and 40s, much dance music, and were there many dances?
Oh, yes.
Plenty of dance bands?
Oh yes. I was advised when I was about 14 to get a saxophone. And of course no one taught those sort of instruments, saxophone, clarinet. There was only one trumpeter, real trumpeter in the whole of Pembrokeshire, an Elder Holman. There was one clarinetist, to my knowledge. So wanted to find out these things, I sent to America and got a book of X-ray embouchures, they call it. The shaping, the actual placing of the teeth on the mouthpiece and so on, and the tonguing of the instrument. And that's, I used to put all these different things together, and I used to get up at 6 every morning and wake up the whole of Portville Avenue blowing the saxophone from about 6:30 in the morning till I went to work at 8:30. I'd rush home from work, from the county offices. I'd be home and eaten my lunch by 1:20. I'd probably practice the violin till between 10 and 5 to 2, then run back to the county offices. Then go return to Portville Avenue, and after tea, practice again if I wasn't playing that evening. Practice again until 9 o'clock, when my next door neighbour, Carey Owen, in the council office, in the council house next door there, used to tap through the fireplace, time for bed now, Joff. So I'd have to finish at 9.
And I think really we've been playing music of one sort or another ever since.
Oh yes. What happened then was that the Marine Band advertised early in the war for musicians afloat. They were taking all these cruisers out of mothballs and so on. And so the result was that professional musicians joined the band. And when I arrived at Deal, the Marines headquarters, I could hear all these people from symphony orchestras, dance bands and so on, and I thought, oh God, I never passed this audition. But I did. And funnily enough, I'd been reading up about the alto and tenor clefs and so on, these, in theory, in the train, and funnily enough I was asked questions about them as well as playing my instrument. And there was a man we called Jimmy Green, who was the composer of Sunset, which they played on the stern of the ships. I played it many times. He'd composed that, and he'd auditioned me. I think he had the rank of major. And I played my clarinet and saxophone. I said, shall I play my fiddle now? I'll never forget this. And he had a big stick and gave me a whack across the backside. And he said, that isn't a bloody fiddle, that's a violin, my boy. Go and get a uniform. So I realised that after I'd done played, of course. So I realised that I'd got into this band. And it's a remarkable coincidence that during the war then, I had great respect for this man. I can't tell you all about him, but during the war, I was returning to a ship in Newcastle, arrived in London and put my bags in lockers to go out and get some food. And there's a blackout, and I went out and a man grabbed me by the shoulders, and he said, I'm sorry. He said, he looked at me and said, I'm very sorry, I thought you were a Royal Marine musician. I said, well, I am actually. Come this way, he said. And he dragged me into a local pub. And this was Jimmy Green, who'd been discharged stone deaf. And it was terribly sad, the tears were in his eyes. He'd been made librarian to the BBC Symphony Orchestra, but he said, it's no use. No. I'm not happy in that. I want to be involved in music myself, you see. Yes.
Yes. Now, much later on then, you formed first of all the Mary Immaculate Band, and then the Haverfordwest Town and County Youth Band.
No. First of all, the British Legion Band.
Oh, right.
Many of those had returned from the forces.
Oh,
very good.
Oh, tell us about the British Legion Band then.
Well, we had about 30 players. Some were professional players. There was a gentleman, Rees Stokes, who was the father of Mrs. Brenda Munt. And in my opinion, he was one of the top euphonium players of Britain. He played in Park and Dare, Corey's, all those bands, very modest man, but a brilliant euphonium. Then we had a man who came under the Blind Act on the trombone, who broadcast on Winner Records, or rather recorded on Winner Records. George Merritt, great man. But with that, the British Legion Band went for 5 years. But unfortunately, we had a huge committee running it. It was awful. Only the secretary and myself were members of a 24-strong committee.
And did you shortly afterwards go to the Mary Immaculate? Or did that
well, a few years afterwards then, I learned how to write for bands, and that's what I wanted to do. So when Father Green then came to me, he'd been left for £350 by a lady on Holy Island. And he decided that he'd buy instruments for the Mary Immaculate School and asked if I'd teach them, so I taught him from scratch. And after 9 months I got him to play a hymn, Soul of My Saviour, and I called Father Green in and he heard the band play for the first time, and he was quite moved about it, and I said, well, that's better than winning the polls, isn't it? You know, to hear a band from nothing. And that went for many years. We played for His Holiness on the St. Peter's Square Rome. We played a number of times in Lourdes in France, in Germany, and a great supporter of the band was Father Sartori, who I reckon I was one of his best friends, really. Unfortunately he died, and then we had some misunderstandings, which with hindsight I'm sure a lot of people regret happening, but that band folded up.
But you continued to...
But within a week I'd formed the Haverfordwest Town Band. We then, the band came on very well, and eventually, that picture will tell you that we won the South Wales and West of England Wind Bands competition, the Gold Award, and then went to Manchester where we won the Bronze Award. The adjudicator at the Brangwyn Hall for the South Wales one was the ex-director of Kneller Hall, and he was quite entranced, you know, he thought it was a very good band.
And have you always enjoyed conducting and working with young people?
Oh yes, hey, it's my life really, yes. I'm still teaching people how to play, you know, yes.